no hablan inglés, hay dispositivos de traducción simultánea para los que quieren términos. Pero pues es un placer presentarnos a los grandes amigos, colegas, compañeros de nuestra problemática de Samuel, donde que quizá mejor que nadie con la excepción de Jesús conoce la vida y trabajo matemático, propiamente dicho, Samuel, en detalle. Y vamos a hablar hoy del trabajo de Samuel Gitler en inmersiones, una aplicación a la robótica. La conferencia será en inglés.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know what you said. I hope it was good. It's a great honor for me to be here on this occasion at the installation of Sam Gitler's portrait here at the Colegio Nacional. Sam was my good friend and colleague for 40 years. We worked together on many questions in algebraic topology, and I visited him many times here in Mexico and also in Rochester, and I greatly appreciated the hospitality that he and Rachel showed to me on all those visits. In the 1960s, Sam and Jose Adem, who is also enshrined in this place, were the leaders in the problem, which was the central problem in algebraic topology at the time, of embedding projective spaces in Euclidean space. I want to talk a little bit about their work on that problem and then how it later had an application in robotics. So I'm going to begin by talking about dimensions. That there's quite a bit of overlap with what I say here in the first couple of minutes and some of the talks already today. But I want to talk about how in algebraic topology we deal with spaces of many dimensions, 100 or 1,000 dimensions, and how could such a space come up in the real world? Well, one way is that if you had an economic situation with many variables and some constraints, then the set of all possible values of those variables which satisfy the constraints is a surface of many, many dimensions. And algebraic topology can study that, and algebraic topology has had useful applications in economics for that reason. But I'm not going to be talking about those kinds of spaces. So we've all seen this morning how three-dimensional space is defined in terms of three coordinates measuring the three different directions. And we have seen how the two-dimensional sphere can be defined as the set of all points in three-dimensional space, satisfying that the sum of the squares of the three numbers equals 1, because that will tell you that the distance from the origin is equal to 1. And we have certainly had a good explanation from Alejandro about how this is, even though it looks like it's in 3 dimensions, we think of it as 2-dimensional because locally it's 2-dimensional. It can be flattened out. And similarly, we'll talk about an n-dimensional sphere as the set of all points in n+1 dimensional space at distance 1 from the origin, which can be defined by a simple equation like that. Now I want to talk about real projective space. Real projective space in two-dimensional real projective space can be defined by taking the sphere and abstractly gluing each point to the point opposite it. Or another way to think about it is as the set of all lines through the origin in 3-dimensional space. Correspondence is that a line intersects the sphere in 2 points, 2 opposite points. And so you think about each line as being a point in this space. and this is a very important space in mathematics. I guess it gets its name because maybe from projections in art, but so the projected plane, it turns out that you cannot physically make a projected plane in three-dimensional space. No matter how much you allow yourself to stretch the sphere, and we've seen in talks this morning that we topologists are very happy to stretch our sphere, but no matter how much you stretch it, you will not be able to physically make a model of this projected two space in three-dimensional space. But as somebody mentioned, I got the Ernesto and Alejandro talks a little bit confused in my mind, but one of them said that with an extra dimension, or maybe that was the Klein model, that you can embed it in four-dimensional space. So this is a very interesting fact that this very concrete topological object can be embedded in four space, but not in three space. So now we go up to many dimensions, and so we can talk about n-dimensional projective space obtained from the n-dimensional sphere by abstractly identifying each point with a point directly opposite it. Or you could think of it as the set of lines through the origin in n+1 dimensional space. And you could ask the question then, for this space, how many dimensions, extra dimensions, are required for it physically to exist, for it to be embedded in Euclidean space? What's the smallest Euclidean space in which Pn can be embedded? So this is a very natural question in topology, and it was a very hot topic back during the 1960s. And at that time, Sam and Jose Adem were the world's experts on this problem. So I put up here that it's J. Adem and S. Gitler because Jose's nephew, Alejandro, is a very distinguished mathematician, and Sam's son, Isidoro, is also a very distinguished mathematician. So I want you to know I'm talking about Sam and Jose here. In 1964, this is just one of many theorems that they proved, typical example of a theorem that they proved. So they're talking here about projective spaces whose dimension is 5 more than a power of 2, and they proved that this cannot be embedded in the Euclidean space of dimension 2 times the dimension of the projective space minus 4. And so this is an optimal result because in the same year that it was proved by Mark Mahowald that it can be embedded in the space of the next higher dimension. So, right, so for example, if you let 2 to the e be 16, e equals 4, then we're talking about the embedding of P21. They showed it can't be embedded in 38, and Mark showed that it can be embedded in 39. Just like to say something about Mark. Those of you who knew Sam would know that Mark was for many years an extremely close colleague of Sam's. They did extraordinary work together. Mark was also my closest colleague for most of my career, and Mark passed away just about a year before Sam did, also at the age of 81. Now I want to talk about immersions. So we've seen about the idea of the Klein bottle can be immersed. Immersions of a space are like embeddings, but they allow nice self-intersections. And so there's going to be a question similar to the embedding question, which is the immersion question. And embeddings is sort of a nicer, more intuitive concept, I guess you'd say. But immersions, it turns out, lend themselves better to techniques of algebraic topology. And so there's much more known about immersions. And also, I would say that immersions have had more interaction with the rest of mathematics as compared to embeddings. So I won't have to spend much time on this slide here because we've already seen how the Klein bottle is a space which can be defined by, you take a rectangle, you identify two sides together to make a cylinder. If you wanted to take that cylinder and bring it around and identify the ends together in a nice way, you get a torus. If you try to identify them in the opposite way, you can't do it, but if you allow a nice self-intersection, then you can do it. So the Klein bottle can be immersed in R3. Here's a picture of an immersed, so the projective space, as I said, cannot be embedded in R3, but it can be immersed in R3. And here's the sort of the standard picture of the Boyce surface that we saw earlier today. I think we were supposed to see a video of it, and I'm very happy to say that I don't have any videos, so everything I prepared you'll get to see. But I don't really understand this picture very well, but it is the classic picture of an immersion of P2 in R3. So there we now have the question of, for each n, find the smallest Euclidean space in which Pn can be immersed. And Sam and Jose did even more work on this one as opposed to embeddings. They proved a huge number of theorems about immersions of projective spaces. And here is just one typical example. So this one's a positive result, an immersion result, whereas the one I showed before was a non-embedding result. You know, to get a good result, you have to prove it both ways. An optimal result requires that you prove that the thing immerses in a certain dimension and not in the next smaller dimension. And so this was typical of the results that they proved, and there were a lot of them. So in 1970, I was a third-year graduate student at Stanford, and I was just beginning my thesis work on a problem related to immersions of projective spaces. And there was a major algebraic topology conference that summer. Unfortunately, I didn't attend it. Sam gave a very important lecture there, and in the conference proceedings, he produced an expository paper about immersions and embeddings of projective spaces and other spaces. And in that paper, he produced a table of all the known immersions of projective spaces. And already at that time, in 1970, the best possible results were known for all the projective spaces up until dimension 24. And the first unknown question at that time was whether P24 can be immersed in R38. It was known that it could be immersed in 39, not in 37. One of those results was due to Sam and Jose, but this was the first unknown question, and it still is. That 45 years of work, many of us have worked hard on trying to resolve this question, Keelam out here especially, and we still don't know the answer to that question. Well, this table of Sam's had a great impact on my work, and so I took and copied it out of the actual volume there, and I've annotated it a little bit over on the end. So you can see how, for all numbers up to 23, they have asterisks, because that's the best possible result, tells the space in which they can be immersed. At 24, you see that it can be immersed in 39, not in 37. There are a few other cases out in the next column where there were results which were not known. And there had been some improvement on that since 1970. You can see that, for example, for n equals 28, that we have improved on both the immersion and non-immersion sides to the extent that we do have an optimal result now for P28. But for the other ones where there's been a little bit of improvement, there's a gap. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on this problem. There's big gaps later on for larger N. I'd just like to point out that the people who have made that improvement are all disciples of Sam's, I would say. The three people who are responsible for those improvements are myself and Louis Astay. I don't know, maybe he's out here today. He was a student of Sam's. And Dwayne Randall, who was certainly a very close follower and colleague of Sam's all those years. The situation for embeddings is not nearly so well known. For example, even for P6, six-dimensional space, it's not known whether it can be embedded in R9 or R10. It can be embedded in 11, not in 8, but it just seems strange to me that for such a small space, we can't answer that question. Well, I've done a lot of work throughout my career on the immersion question. I've proved many families of results. I worked with Sam on some of those, and I produced a table. I have a table on my website of all the known results about immersions and embeddings of projective spaces, which I think has been influential to some people, and it's certainly a follow-up to the important impact that Sam's table had on my work. So now I'd like to talk about an unexpected application of immersions of projective spaces to robotics. So there's a new field of topological robotics that has been developed over the past 15 or 20 years, led by Michael Farber, a mathematician who has been associated with various British universities during that time. And he has invented the idea of topological complexity. Topological complexity of a space is the number of rules required to tell you how to move from any point of the space to any other point of the space. And the rule has to be continuous in the sense that if you vary the points by a little bit, you don't vary the path by very much. And so this is an important invariant associated to a topological space, and the interaction of this with robotics is that if you could take the space of all configurations of a robot as a topological space, and then you could say that the topological complexity of that space is the number of rules required to tell you how to move to program the robot to move from any one configuration to any other. So during the past couple of years, so in 2003, there was a very surprising theorem proved by Farber and two of his colleagues. They proved that the topological complexity of projective space is equal to exactly one more than its immersion dimension. So if you, and their proof was rather constructive, so that if you had an explicit immersion of the projective space in Euclidean space, you could use that to construct the motion planning rules for that projective space. However, most of our immersion results are not constructive. Usually, the way we get them is there's obstructions in algebraic topology to making an immersion, and you use algebraic topology to show that all those obstructions are zero. So I don't know that we've got any new motion planning rules for projective spaces that way. But one thing that you can do for sure is you could say that if you have a non-immersion result, then you know that at least yay many motion planning rules will be required for the projective space. Well, projective space is the set of lines through the origin in Rn plus 1. So this topological complexity how many rules are required to move from one line in Rn+1 to another. I don't think that's a very useful robot, probably. But during the past couple of years, influenced by Jesus Gonzalez here, I have been working on studying the topological complexity of what are called planar polygon spaces. So a planar polygon space is a space of all polygons with sides of prescribed lengths in the plane. So you take, if you want n-sided polygon with sides of lengths, prescribed lengths given by those numbers L1 up to Ln, then you can talk about the space of all polygons in the plane with those lengths. Now, we want, well, the connection of these polygons with robotics is that you can think of the sides of a polygon. Well, here, let me put this next slide up here. You could think of the sides of a polygon as linked arms of a robot. And so here's one polygons with 3 sides of length 1 and 1 of length 2. And so say start at the beginning of the one with the arrow, and so you've got an arm there, and then you can rotate that next arm, rotate the third one, rotate the fourth one, and get different polygons. So here we sort of artificially require that you get back to where you started, but you could vary that requirement a little bit without much change to the theory. So you would want to, if you've got a robot here and you've got the same robot over there, you'd want to think about those as being the same robot. So we identify them under translation, we identify them under rotation, and maybe a little less intuitively, we identify them also under reflection. So that second polygon there can be obtained by rotating the first one down, counterclockwise. The third one is obtained by reflecting the first one. And then that third one there, of course, it's not equivalent. It doesn't even look like a polygon, but we allow the sides to intersect themselves like that, and you can arrange your robot to allow that kind of intersection. So if you could tell the topological complexity of this space of planar polygons, then you would know how many rules are required to program one of these sort of simple kinds of robots to move from any configuration to any other. Well, what's that got to do with projective space? Well, on New Year's Eve, I'm happy to say that I realized that if you take the polygon space with all sides of length 1 except for one side of length n, and that side is one less than the side length is one less than the number of ones, that space is topologically equivalent to the projective space Pn minus 1. So I was very excited when I discovered this because so this is the relationship now with immersions and robotics, real robotics, because if you know about the immersion dimension of projective space, then you know about the topological complexity of this space of robots here. Well, I put my result up on the internet and found out that it was a result which was known to other experts in the field. It was not really a new result. But my construction of the equivalence here was more elementary and more explicit than the others. I mean, I've been studying the literature, and I really found it was really buried there because I hadn't seen it. But and I was the first one to make this connection of the immersion question with the robotic question, and so I wrote a paper on it that was published this summer in Jesus's journal Morfismo here in Mexico. So this this is my sort of conclusion that you information about robotics. And I think this is a very nice example of the way that work in pure mathematics that's done for its own sake can turn out to have applications that were never ever envisioned by the people doing that work. And so I'd just like to close by saying thank you, Sam, for your great impact on my life and my work, and for all the important work that you did in mathematics, and mostly just for being such a wonderful person.
Lord, if you do not allow your polygons to self-intersect, what is your empire?
Oh, nobody thinks about that. I don't know, but I think it would be it probably wouldn't be a manifold, and it would probably not be something wonderful.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank the very nice talk by Donald.